Hello and welcome to this week's lecture where we're going to focus on the topic of perception. Specifically, we're going to focus on three questions or three topics. We're going to start by thinking about how perception is different from sensation. So what are the distinctions and the key properties of perception? And then we're going to focus on our abilities for both pattern and object recognition. So how is it when we're walking around our environment that we're so easily able, when we see an object or a pattern such as some text that's written down, how can we easily infer what this object is or understand the text that we're reading? And to most of us, these things seem trivial. They're things that happen easily. You look at the text and you automatically know what word. So you look at the word perception that's written there. You don't need to invest any special cognitive effort to understand what that word is, despite the fact maybe I've written in a slightly weird font that's on the title screen here. But it happens with absolute ease. But these are, underneath the surface, these are pretty complex processes that are going on here. And we can sort of get an insight into the complexity of this process when you look at efforts that go into artificial intelligence and programming object and text recognition, which requires incredibly sophisticated algorithms. So we need this visual perception for not only our kind of everyday life, but navigating things such as when you're driving or trying to cross the road. There's situations that we need very accurate visual perception in order to safely engage with the world. If our visual perception was a little bit off, we'd be prone to get into accidents regularly, and we probably wouldn't survive very long. It's also important for stuff like recognizing people. So face recognition will be the topic for next week. And that's an ability that you use almost every day. So when you're encountering friends or strangers, you're automatically processing their faces and trying to understand, do I recognize this person? And what details are stored in terms of their name and background knowledge that you have of this person. It's also important for stuff like reading books, for knowledge, and maybe most importantly for watching Netflix and scrolling through Instagram or TikTok, or whatever keeps you going. Okay, so before we get started, what I want you to do is just have a think for yourself. What do you think is a definition of sensation and perception? And what do you think might be the distinction between the two of these? So the title of the slide here is Sensation is not Perception. There's a pretty big clue that the two things differ from each other. So write down, just take a few moments to do this. What do you think is sensation and what do you think is perception? Pause the video and come back when you've had a go at that. Okay, so sensation is not perception. What is it? So sensation, the definition that comes in most of the textbooks, is the intake of information by means of receptors and translation of this information to signals that the brain can process as images, sounds, smells, tastes, etc. So if we break that down in a visual perception or visual sensation context, what they'll be looking at is this process of, for example, light hitting onto the retina and then being processed through activation in the rods and the cone cells that you have in your eye that would then send and transmit a signal reflecting those different light waves and the activity in the rods and cones, would transmit the signal that goes to the visual cortex in the brain. So that would be a kind of raw sensation process. In contrast, perception is the interpretation and understanding of sensations. So if we think of the fact that we're continually bombarded with input, so around you right now there's multiple bits of visual input that you're receiving, you're getting auditory input listening to me, there might be something else going on in the background. Perception is your ability to not only focus on these things, but out of the things that you do focus on, how do we turn all of this sensation into something that is meaningful and something that you comprehend and can interact with potentially. So essentially what perception is a combination of us taking this raw sensory input, so the raw sensations and signals that are coming in through whichever, whether it's auditory, visual channels, etc., and combining this with our pre-existing expectations, biases, knowledge about the way that the world is coordinated and organized, which we refer to as top-down processing or top-down inputs. So these prior expectations and beliefs can determine the way that we end up processing this raw sensory input. And ultimately, the two of these combine to lead to this kind of constructed perception that combines both classes of information. And we're going to see in some of the visual illusions that you'll look at during this class, you'll see some instances where our top-down expectations can clearly bias and lead to mistakes in the way that we end up perceiving the true nature of the world. So we'll come across some examples of this. What I want to do to start with, though, is give you a few examples of how the raw visual stimulus can combine with prior knowledge to influence our perception of something that we're looking at. So just have a careful look at the image that's presented on the screen here. What I want you to do is try and work out what is it that you're looking at on this image here. So there's a figure that's in this visual field right now. I'm not going to tell you, I'm just going to give you a few seconds to look at it and see if you can get it. Now, if you've never seen this image before, you will find it probably quite challenging or quite difficult to work out what it is that's there. Okay, shall we have a look what it is? Now, if I highlight it here, you can see pretty clearly there's a Dalmatian dog that's kind of camouflaged within all the spots here. And it's really challenging and difficult to try and discern and pick out this Dalmatian that's standing amongst a very similar sort of camouflaged white background, because you can't easily pick out those contours or the edge that is going to define the dog, and you've got the spotted texture of the dog is already blending in very well. Now, the thing that is remarkable with this top-down expectation or the top-down knowledge that you bring to the raw visual input is if I show you that same image again that you saw before, so we take away the sort of red indicator around where that Dalmatian is, and now that you know it's a Dalmatian that's there, it should change your perception of the same visual stimuli. So you should now, and most likely forever, for the rest of your life, if you come across this same visual stimuli, so this image, that Dalmatian will jump out for you. So we've, just by giving you some knowledge and additional expectations of what is featured within that image, we're changing entirely the perception that we have of it. So we look at this image in an entirely different light to how we would have looked at it 2 minutes ago. So that's one example. Let's see another example of this. So again, doing this is effectively kind of rewiring your brain, of just giving you a little bit of knowledge in terms of what's there. So see if you can work out what the image is represented in this example. So again, you've got here your eyes and brain inform you that some parts of this figure are black and others are white. These are sensations. So you've got pure sensations of the different colours, but you're not able to really comprehend or perceive any structure or object within this. There's no ability to interpret and understand these raw sensations. If we now put the outline, you can pause it if you really want to persist and try and work out what it is. If we put the outline on here, we can see pretty clearly this is the outline of a cowboy. So it's a cowboy riding a horse. And again, if we go back to the original representation here of this image, you'd find it very difficult to look at this and not see the cowboy. Let's do one more. So again, this is an image with black and white. It's degraded. It's very difficult to pick out the contours of. So this is an insect that features on here. If I tell you that it's a frog that you're looking at, for most people this frog will then jump out and they'll be able to see that it's a frog from now onwards, and you can't really sort of unsee the fact that it's a frog here. If you don't believe me, we can look at, this is an image with the full contrast on there. So in this image you can easily pick out the edges, and you can see that where the head is. Probably the biggest clue in this one is the sort of bulbous eyes with the pupils down the middle. You can pick out these sort of circles are potentially indicating the eye, and you've got this big arc for the mouth here. But again, now that I've told you it's a frog, when you look at this image, it's really hard to see anything but frog. It just seems natural. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is a photo that was taken at a music festival. So I want you just to have a look at the image that's on the screen, see if you notice anything unusual about this. Now, for me, and I think for tens of thousands of other people who have seen this image before and commented on it on Twitter, for me, it naturally, when somebody first shared this and I looked at it, it seemed like a scene that was taken from a music festival. You've got the lights that are up there at the front that look like they're on stage, and then you've got all these bobbing heads of people that are just enjoying the nighttime rave, the nighttime party. And it's only when you start to look a little bit closer that you realise that these bobbing heads is cotton in the field, and you've got a big tractor with its lights on that are coming towards you. So I think this is one example of where, for example, the expectations that you have of what sorts of images somebody is likely to share on social media, if you look at it, it's much more easier to resolve it in terms of somebody shared a photo of a nighttime gig rather than thinking somebody's sharing me a photo of a cotton field. Now, if I told you at the start that, look at this next photo, it shows you a cotton field that's got a harvester going around, you probably wouldn't notice or interpret this as being a music festival. Hey, you may not have thought it was a music festival. It's not going to trick everybody. Another example here is, do you see anything unusual with this logo? So this is the logo for the 2014 Football World Cup that was in Brazil. And for me, when I've looked at this, I don't notice anything that really seems untowards. But if I now tell you that this looks like a guy doing a face palm, so kind of like this with the yellow hand and then the hair that's coming down in green over the side. This and similar images are often shared under the hashtag #Can'tUnsee. And the reason is, once you start to have this knowledge, so you've got this top-down insight into the fact that it looks like potentially someone with a face palm, now for me, every time I see that logo, I end up perceiving it in a fundamentally different way to how I might have perceived it before. So again, you've got the same visual input that's being shown to you and the same visual input that you're processing before and after you have this knowledge, but you can often end up with different perceptions. So there's different ways that you represent the same stimuli when you look at it. So in summary, perception is more than the passive registration of sensory input. So for example, light stimuli that hits our retina. It involves interpretation of the most likely stimulus on the basis of the input that we've got and past previous experience.